This is The Modern SME, and our guest today is Mr. Mowli. Mr. Mowli is a business consultant at Leap to Excel Consulting, a firm that provides consulting services to Indian SMEs across all industry verticals. Earlier, he was a CFO of a listed ball bearing manufacturing company with 28 years of experience. Sir, welcome to the show. It is an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure.
So you have a vast experience in the industrial sector. And currently with the PLI scheme and India presenting itself as the next world manufacturing hub, where do you see the sector going?
The industrial sector?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, as you know that India has been progressing from an agrarian-based economy to, I would say, directly leapfrogged into the service-based economy. And somewhere, manufacturing sector hasn't grown, hasn't contributed to the GDP as much as a normal evolution of an economy happens when they move from an agrarian-based economy to a developed economy. Somewhere we leapfrogged from the agrarian economy, and agriculture used to be a major contributor to our GDP. We skipped, in a way, the manufacturing development, and we went straight to a service-based economy, with services now contributing more than 55% of our total GDP, and manufacturing still only around 20%, 18 to 20%, and agriculture being the other 15 to 18%. So somewhere we sort of, normally the developed world, the Western world, is heavily service oriented, and we went straight there without passing through the normal route of going from agriculture to manufacturing and then evolving into a service-based economy. Now, why is this important for a country like us, which has a very large population? Because manufacturing creates a lot of jobs, and therefore the government is now trying hard to make the contribution of manufacturing in our GDP much bigger. That's the aim of the government, and the PLI scheme is one such. It's not the only one that can make it, but it's one such tool, or let's say one such step that the government has taken to boost manufacturing in India. Now, in a way, if you go back 30 years, 40 years, India and China were more or less same size economies. And today, China is probably 10 to 15 times bigger than India. And that's because China embraced this manufacturing led growth in the economy somewhere in the 1980s. And over a period of time, over a period of long time, 20, 25 years, it developed into becoming almost a manufacturing hub for the whole world. It became the factory for the world, and a lot of production for world requirements, for global requirements, started to be made in China. It started initially with what people said were very cheap imitations, but over a period of time, China has now become technologically so advanced that it really became a manufacturing hub for the world. This was led by the fact that government incentives and government lot of steps to make manufacturing very competitive in China by creating fantastic infrastructure. I've been to China myself personally. I've seen the kind of development that they have done. Over-invested in infrastructure, sometimes people would say, but doesn't matter. And coupled with the fact that labor cost was very low in China. That's no longer the case. Labor cost in China has gone up. It's still considerably lower than what it is in the Western world, but it's not as low as it was before. But probably China would have continued being this manufacturing hub for the world, but for two things that happened, I think, in the recent past. One, there started a trade war between US and China, in the sense that US felt that the balance of trade was so heavily in favor of China versus US, that US felt that this needed to be reversed or needed to be corrected, rebalanced to some extent. So we had all these import duties on Chinese made goods and other sanctions, or not sanctions, but restrictions on importing from China, etc. US was not very happy with the fact that Chinese currency, which they felt should have been much stronger compared to the dollar, was not as strong. The government was intervening to keep it at a level that was making Chinese exports extremely competitive and US imports uh, into China uncompetitive. So that was the beginning, but I think that would have probably sorted itself out. But then what compounded that, or a completely different event that happened, of course, which everybody knows, was the COVID. And when COVID happened, the world realized that basing your entire requirements from a single country, from a single geography like China, while it led to a very low cost for the importing countries in the West, COVID disruptions meant that the world started to look up and said, hey, we cannot rely entirely on one country, because if that country has a problem, maybe a pandemic related problem, and therefore if the entire trade and supply chains get disrupted, we need to de-risk ourselves. So then many countries started to develop what we loosely call the China plus one strategy, which is basically countries have realized that it's risky to put all your eggs in one basket and import everything that you need from China. And if China has a genuine health problem, a pandemic problem, or tomorrow it could be a tsunami, it could be anything, then relying on just one country for bulk of your supply chain requirements would make it a bit risky. And therefore, countries started to look at alternatives. So I think the Indian government pitched the PLI scheme also more or less at the right time when countries were looking to alternatives. By no means is India the only alternative. So when we say China plus one, we very quickly imagine that that plus one will be India, but there are many other countries that are also in the fray for getting a part of that, what China is losing out, and getting a part of it. So there's Vietnam, there's Thailand, there's other Southeast Asian countries, and then there are also countries in Latin America which can be a very good alternative. But let's say India is definitely one of the countries that can be a credible alternative to China. So the PLI scheme is basically government's initiative to boost manufacturing from India, not only for Indian domestic requirements, which is large by itself because of our population, but also to be able to make such scale, economies of scale in India by creating large factories that will reduce the cost, make India more cost competitive, and help to make in India to supply to other parts of the world. It's basically the same thing that China did. It started 40 years back. India is now sort of getting into it. So PLI scheme is basically production linked incentive that the government is trying to encourage. And I think it's met with some very good results. So the PLI scheme plus the China plus one strategy, both of them have sort of come together at this right time for Indian manufacturing to sort of kick off. And we can see some sectors where Indian exports are doing much better now than they were doing before. PLI scheme is definitely one of them. It's one of the facilitations that have happened to make that possible. We still need to do a lot of other things to make India exports competitive, or to make India as a preferred destination for buying for the Western world in terms of infrastructure, in terms of ease of doing business, a whole lot of such things. But PLI is one thing that has definitely helped. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So PLI scheme is mainly for large companies. If we will read schemes, they approve maybe top 10, top 20 companies in that industry. So how do SMEs take benefit of this PLI scheme? How do they take the advantage? How do they get in the picture?
Yeah. So as you rightly said, the government has got a limited amount of budgetary outlay that it can spend on PLI for a particular sector. There are now 14 sectors that PLI scheme has been announced. I think probably 3 more are coming up. 17 is probably where it will. And the government is adding more and more sectors each time, right? So obviously there's limitations of money. So everybody who applies for PLI scheme cannot get it. And given that the PLI scheme is in order to make Indian manufacturing extremely competitive, you need to have economies of scale to be able to lower your cost of production and make yourselves competitive. If you see China, anything they produce is on such a massive scale. I've seen factories there in China that do off anything that are there in India in many sectors. But India has its own strengths in certain areas. So given that limitation, when PLI scheme is announced for whatever sector, it is almost inevitable that you need size in order to be able to qualify for the PLI scheme. And obviously there, the big corporates will get the benefit. Even amongst them, there's competition. So obviously, yeah. Having said that, there are still, I have seen some small companies which have managed to get benefits of PLI if they can create a niche for themselves in certain critical industry sectors. So for example, I've seen that there are some companies with an investment of only 5 crores in PLI scheme, but they manufacture something that the government thinks is an extremely critical product, like oxygen concentrators, like stents for heart surgery, things like that.
Drones, maybe.
Yeah, so there are some exceptions, but you're right. The basic rule is that, or basic thing is that the bigger the size, the chances of getting qualified for PLI are better, because at the end of the day, you have to realize what is the real objective of the government in the PLI scheme. It is to make India extremely competitive for the world market, one. Secondly, to promote job creation, which comes with size. When you're big, you will employ a lot more people, to earn valuable foreign exchange for India, to reduce our dependency on imports. So all these are naturally tilted towards big corporates or big businesses, right? Having said that, where can SMEs fit in? So in my opinion, most of the big corporates do not do all the manufacturing of everything that is needed inside their own company. They outsource a lot of things and they buy a lot of things from vendors. Now, these vendors can also be big, or these vendors can be small. So you have obviously tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and so on. So I'm sure that when a sector gets benefits under PLI, even if the direct first beneficiary that the government gives the incentive to is a big corporate, somewhere in the supply chain, in the value chain, you will have SMEs come in. So if that sector grows, because now more investments are coming into that sector, and India is producing a lot more of those products, because not only for domestic needs, but also for global needs. Then when the sector grows, obviously everybody associated with that sector can grow, including the small and medium enterprises that are somewhere in the value chain, in the supply chain of that sector. So the way for the SMEs to play the PLI scheme is, if you're very, very lucky, you will get directly qualified and you will become one of the beneficiaries of PLI. But if not, you become a part of the value chain, a part of the supply chain of that sector. That's the way I think SMEs will also benefit, because at the end of the day, SMEs will grow if their customers who are big corporates grow. So with growth, everybody will grow. So that's
the sector sees a general tailwind.
Exactly.